According to StatCounter, which tracks web activities across more than 1 million monitored websites worldwide, Windows fell to 56.61% of global desktop market share in June 2026. That is the first time in the entire history of StatCounter's dataset that Windows has ever closed a month below 60%. At the same time, Linux reached 4.36%, its highest reading in a year. Now, is this a blip, a one-month statistical anomaly that will quietly correct itself? Or is this the first visible crack in the most dominant monopoly personal computing has ever produced? Stay with me, because what I found when I dug into this story is more complicated and more significant than any headline tells you. StatCounter's number is a verified number. It is the first sub-60 reading in the history of their dataset. StatCounter counts page views across the sites that run its tracking code and infers the operating system from signals like browser user agent strings. And in June's data, there was a notable complication. A category labeled unknown operating systems ballooned to over 21%, up from roughly 8% the month before. StatCounter later indicated that some of that traffic had been misclassified and revised its figures. When analysts strip out the unknown category and look only at identified systems, Windows sits closer to 72% of the desktop market. So why are we talking about this? Because even before June's data dropped, the direction of travel was already alarming. In February of this year, Windows still held 66.6% by StatCounter's measure. By June, even accounting for the data noise, it was in the mid-50s to low 70s depending on how you count. That is a meaningful compression regardless of which number you use. The long-term trend is not ambiguous. Linux desktop share has grown from 2.76% in July 2022 to roughly 4.7% at its recent peak. That is more than 70% growth in under 3 years. On Steam, Valve's own hardware survey, which is a separate dataset and a direct count of active gaming machines, put Linux at 5.33% in March 2026. That is an all-time record on the platform, and it represented a year-over-year increase of more than 3 percentage points. These are not the numbers of a platform dying, but they are also not the numbers of a platform as secure as it was 5 years ago. And the reason why takes us back to a decision Microsoft made and a promise it broke. For most of the history of personal computing, Windows was not just the dominant operating system. It was, functionally, the only operating system that most people ever considered. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Windows routinely commanded 85, 90, even 95% of the global desktop market. Linux existed, Apple's Mac existed, but they were rounding errors. Windows was the desktop. That dominance came from a combination of factors that were nearly impossible to challenge. Virtually every piece of commercial software was written for Windows, every enterprise department was built around it, and every new PC that shipped from a major manufacturer came with it pre-installed. The default was so deeply embedded that most people did not think of choosing an operating system the same way they chose a car or a phone. You got Windows because the computer came with Windows. Then came Windows 10. Microsoft released Windows 10 in July 2015, and at the time, it made a promise that was unusual for a software company. Windows 10, Microsoft said, would be the last version of Windows. Rather than selling new operating systems every few years, Microsoft would simply keep updating the one version. Free updates forever, it was a significant shift, and millions of people organized their technology decisions around that commitment. That commitment did not hold. In June 2021, Microsoft announced Windows 11, and with it, a set of hardware requirements that immediately excluded a large portion of the machines people were running. The central requirement was something called TPM 2.0, a trusted platform module, a small security chip that Microsoft called, in their own words, a non-negotiable requirement. Processors older than Intel's 8th generation or AMD's Ryzen 2000 series were officially locked out. Microsoft's reasoning was legitimate on paper. TPM 2.0 improves hardware-level security, protects encryption keys, and helps defend against firmware attacks. But the practical reality was that millions of perfectly functional computers, machines that were fast, capable, and in daily use did not qualify. And the clock was already ticking on the deadline that would make that exclusion matter, but the full weight of that decision would not be felt until October 2025. And what happened that month is where this story truly begins to accelerate. On October 14, 2025, Microsoft ended support for Windows 10. No more security patches, no more bug fixes, no more protection against vulnerabilities discovered after that date. For users who could upgrade to Windows 11, the path was clear. For those whose machines did not meet the TPM 2.0 requirement, the choice came down to three options: pay for extended security updates at $30 a year, attempt a workaround installation on unsupported hardware, or find a different operating system entirely. The scale of people facing that choice was enormous. Major PC manufacturers estimated that roughly half of computers still running Windows 10 at the time of end of support could not cleanly upgrade to Windows 11 through official channels. Industry analysts put the total number of affected machines at around 240 million. Even a conservative reading of those figures means tens of millions of people were pushed to a decision point with no clean path forward. What happened next was immediate and documented. Within 5 weeks of Windows 10's end of support, a single Linux distribution called Zorin OS, designed specifically to look and feel familiar to Windows users, reported that its latest release had been downloaded more than 1 million times, breaking all previous records for the project. The developers disclosed that approximately 780,000 of those users had migrated directly from Windows. 78% of the downloads came from machines previously running Windows. That is 750,000 people in a 5-week window, making a move to a different operating system that most of them had almost certainly never seriously considered before. And Zorin OS is one Linux distribution among dozens. It was not alone in seeing this surge. The question is whether those users stayed, and what is happening to the broader numbers as their decisions ripple through the data. The migration from Windows 10 was the clearest single driver. But it did not happen in isolation. Several other pressures were building at the same time, and together they created conditions that the desktop OS market has not seen before. Hardware costs compounded the problem. According to industry pricing data, DRAM memory prices rose 171% year over year in the period leading up to Windows 10's end of support. For someone sitting on a 7-year-old laptop that Windows 11 would not officially accept, the cost of a new machine was not trivial. When the choice is between spending $800 on new hardware to stay on Windows or spending nothing to put Linux on the machine you already own, that is a real financial calculation, and more people ran that calculation seriously than at any point in the past. Gaming, historically the most effective argument for keeping people on Windows, began to weaken as a barrier. Valve's Proton compatibility layer, which allows Linux to run Windows games without a port, now covers approximately 106,000 of Steam's total game catalog. ProtonDB, which tracks real-world compatibility testing, reported that roughly 90% of Windows titles launched on Linux as of late 2025. Steam's own hardware survey recorded Linux at 5.33% in March 2026, a number that is small in absolute terms but represents more than double what it was 18 months earlier. The geographic picture also shifted. The United States crossed 5% Linux desktop share for the first time in June 2025, according to StatCounter. In India, Linux desktop share sits at over 16%. European governments accelerated their own migrations. Germany's state of Schleswig-Holstein replaced Microsoft tools with Linux and LibreOffice across its operations. And France runs more than 100,000 Linux machines in its national gendarmerie. Then, June 2026's data arrived. And even accounting for the data complications StatCounter later acknowledged, Windows had its worst ever month on record, and Linux had one of its strongest. The word worst applied to Windows in a statistical sentence is, as of this summer, a sentence that can now be written about the most dominant software platform in the history of personal computing. The human cost of all of this sits with a specific group of people. And that is where this story becomes something more than a chart. When Microsoft ended support for Windows 10 in October 2025, The Extended Security Update Program, $30 a year for continued patches, was available, but it was a stopgap, not a solution. And it ran through October 2026 at most for most users. The clock was still running. The 780,000 users who moved to Zorin OS in 5 weeks after that deadline are the visible evidence of that decision being made at scale. But Zorin OS was tracking downloads. Most Linux distributions do not publish detailed migration data. The actual number of people who made a similar move across all distributions is unknown and almost certainly larger. What the data does show is what those people found on the other side. Zorin OS was designed deliberately to ease that transition. The desktop layout mirrors Windows, the application menu is familiar, the learning curve is reduced. The Steam Deck, Valve's handheld gaming device that runs Linux, introduced millions of people, including people who would never describe themselves as Linux users, to the experience of running Linux without realizing that is what they were doing. Proton made the games they already owned work on an operating system they had never considered. The profile of the Linux switcher in 2025 and 2026 is not who it was in 2010. It is not primarily a developer or a hobbyist. It is increasingly someone who was pushed, not pulled. Someone who had a working computer and was told it was not good enough. Someone who did the math on a new machine and decided the price was too high. Someone who discovered, often with surprise, that the alternative was more accessible than they expected. That shift in who is moving, not just how many, may be the most significant long-term development in this data. And it brings us to the question that this video was built around. So let's answer it honestly. Is what we are seeing the beginning of the end for Windows dominance? Or is this a temporary disruption that Microsoft will absorb? The case that this is a blip is not weak. Windows at 56%, or 72% if you exclude the unknown category, is still the most dominant desktop platform in the world by a very large margin. One Linux distribution, however impressive its growth, gained 780,000 users in 5 weeks. There are an estimated 1.6 billion Windows devices. The math of displacement at that scale is sobering for anyone predicting a near-term Windows collapse. The StatCounter number itself deserves scrutiny. StatCounter revised its June 2026 data after the unknown category anomaly was identified and explained. The measurement is web traffic, not installed machines. Steam's numbers, which are a direct hardware survey, still show Windows above 90% on gaming PCs as of early 2026. The two datasets are measuring different things, and neither one alone tells the complete story. Microsoft confirmed that Windows is currently installed on 1.6 billion devices worldwide, and that number is likely growing as new hardware ships with Windows 11. The enterprise market, corporations, governments, institutions, is Windows territory in a way that individual consumer switching does not immediately touch. Corporate departments do not migrate operating systems on the strength of a StatCounter reading. The case that this is the beginning of a structural shift is also not weak. The trend line is real, and it has been moving in one direction for 3 consecutive years. Linux desktop growth from 2.76% to near 5% in under 3 years across multiple independent tracking methodologies is not noise. The Windows 10 end-of-support event created a one-time pressure that pushed millions of users to evaluate alternatives, and many of them found those alternatives workable. Hardware prices, which drove some of that evaluation, have not collapsed. The TPM 2.0 requirement has not changed. The population of machines that cannot officially run Windows 11 has not shrunk. The most significant long-term risk for Microsoft is not that Linux overtakes Windows on the desktop in the next 5 years. It will not. The risk is that the group of people who choose Windows out of genuine preference, rather than default inertia or lack of alternatives, continues to shrink. And here is why the title of this video says it is getting worse, not just getting different. Microsoft's answer to the pressure it is facing is Copilot+, a new tier of AI-integrated hardware that requires a dedicated neural processing chip, effectively setting a new hardware floor above what Windows 11 already demands. Features like Recall, Microsoft's AI-powered activity timeline, are being reserved exclusively for Copilot Plus devices. The pattern is the same one that produced October 2025. Microsoft defines a new capability, ties it to new hardware requirements, and tells existing users that their machines are not good enough. If that playbook runs again, the population of people facing a dead end will grow, not shrink. Every time Microsoft raises a barrier, costs, requirements, mandatory AI features, telemetry that users cannot fully disable, it is performing a calculation. And the calculation assumes that there is nowhere else to go. That assumption is becoming less true every year. In October 2025, Microsoft made a decision about 400 million people. Some bought new machines. Some paid for extended security updates and bought themselves another year. And some, in numbers that surprised even the Linux community, opened a browser, downloaded a different operating system, and discovered that the computer they already owned still worked fine. That is what moved the number. Not hackers. Not idealists. Not a conspiracy against Microsoft. Ordinary people, making a reasonable decision about a working machine, choosing the path that did not cost them anything. The question we opened with, is this the beginning of the end, or just a blip, has a real answer. It is neither, precisely. Windows is not collapsing. But Windows is no longer immovable. For the first time in the history of this dataset, the assumption that the number could only go up has been proved wrong. The floor that everyone assumed was solid turned out to have some give in it. What happens next depends heavily on what Microsoft does with Windows 11 and whatever comes after it. And that is the subject of the next video in this series, what Microsoft actually has planned for the future of Windows, what the Copilot Plus PC strategy is really about, and whether the company's bet on AI-integrated hardware will bring users back or drive more of them away. If you have watched this far, you already know this is not a channel that tells you what to think. It is a channel that tells you what is happening and lets you decide what it means. If that is what you are looking for, subscribe, because the Windows story is not finished, and neither are we.